Warm greetings to one and all present. It is indeed a great honor for me to welcome all our esteemed panelists and audience members to the 28th Convergence India and the 6th Smart Cities India Expo, organized by Exhibitions India Group and the India Trade Promotion Organization. The third and upcoming session under our virtual Clean and Water India Summit, titled Climate Resilience in Indian Cities, is being conducted in partnership with our Climate Smart Cities partner, WWF India. We thank them for their continued support. Joining us today on the panel for this session are Dr. Alpi John Varghese, IAS, Regional Deputy Commissioner, Greater Chennai Corporation, Dr. Uma Maheshwaran Rajshekhar, Head Climate Center for Cities and Chair Urban Resilience, National Institute of Urban Affairs, Dr. Vinita Apte, Founder Director, TERE Policy Center India, Dr. Fayaz Khotsar, Scientist in Charge, Yamuna Biodiversity Park, Dr. Harini Nagendra, Professor, Sustainability, School of Development, Azim Premji University, and Tallulah De Silva, Founder and Principal Architect at Architecture T. Dr. Suchismita Mukhopadhyay, Associate Director, Climate Change and Energy at WWF India, will be our moderator for this session. Now, before I hand over the session to Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I would like to inform our audience that this session will be live streamed on our Facebook page, that is, at IoT India Expo. And of course, the visitors who are attending our physical event at Pragati Maidan, New Delhi, can also watch this session live via our official event app, Swapcard. I also request all our esteemed speakers to kindly keep their microphone on mute when it is not in use to ensure complete clarity and no disturbance during the session. Also, the final few minutes of the session will be utilized for the Q&As. Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I now hand over the session to you.
Thank you, Divyank. Welcome to everyone once again for this session today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the EIG group for partnering with us once again for this very important discussion. We thank all our distinguished panelists for joining us, and we look forward to learn more about your thoughts, your insights and experiences regarding this extremely relevant topic of climate resilience in Indian cities, where we stand, the challenges, opportunities, and the way forward. As we all know, more than half of the world's population currently resides in cities, collectively contributing to about 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, cities use a large part of the world's energy supply, and therefore cities are basically seen as major contributors to climate change through the various urban-related activities. But what often goes unnoticed or not so much discussed is that while cities are contributors, cities are also amongst the most impacted by climate change. Some of the estimates say that more than 70% of the cities globally are already dealing with the effects of climate change, and cities in India are extremely vulnerable too. And we've been seeing in the past few years instances of water stress, heat island effect, increased frequency of extreme events like urban floods and droughts. Therefore, climate smart planning in the long run will basically decide the extent and the impact of climate change and the ability to achieve emissions reduction, as well as the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. And therefore, investing in climate adaptation is not only crucial, but is also a sound investment for the cities. There is also emphasis on, increased emphasis on the accelerated progress on urban resilience by improving the resilience of essential services in cities through the climate smart projects, including storm-proof affordable housing, nature-based solutions, inclusive and sustainable sanitation systems. And just to summarize, cities therefore are becoming extremely important, and in the long run they're going to play a very significant role in climate change, both in terms of mitigation as well as in terms of building resilience. A lot of cities are actually now realizing the importance of seamlessly integrating local urban development plans along with climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. And in doing so, there is a lot of support from the already existing policy initiatives, the new schemes that are being introduced. And there is also a more concerted effort in terms of sort of aligning a lot of our schemes and missions with the overall national climate agenda. And we will be discussing some of that during this session. So climate proofing cities basically will then involve strengthening the adaptive capacity, reducing the vulnerability of the urban systems against climate change, developing strategies and policies and instruments for building resilience of the city and its inhabitants. And in doing all of this, also get the local co-benefits of reduced pollution and a better quality of life and health for the citizens. Some of the examples that that are very obvious and which have sort of been highlighted a lot and are now being replicated across the country are in terms of say the heat action plan for Ahmedabad that was developed in 2013, and which was the first heat action plan and the early warning system in South Asia, and now that's being replicated across several cities in India. Surat was the pioneer cities that prepared the urban resilience strategy supported by Rockefeller, and then Pune and Chennai went on to prepare their own strategies. The role of biodiversity, the urban biodiversity, nature-based solutions is being increasingly discussed, and it's coming up as an important solution for to basically contribute to the climate resilience discussion. So cities are preparing local biodiversity action plans. Cities are working on restoring and conserving urban wetlands, realizing that they can help in averting major floods, treating waste, complementing the usually inadequate sewage management infrastructure, etc. So in this session, basically, we are going to discuss primarily that climate resilience in cities. What are cities basically doing? We have our distinguished panelists who are going to talk to us about their learnings, their experiences, challenges and opportunities from several success stories that they have been a part of in our cities. And also we would like to hear a little bit more about how nature-based solutions are being integrated into our planning by the Indian cities, like say in terms of enhancing the green cover, in terms of enhancing planting more trees, the urban forestry schemes, and how is it that missions like the Smart City mission and through this the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework, how are these frameworks basically trying to enhance the integration of better urban planning, green cover, biodiversity, mobility, air quality, and all of these different aspects. We have the new Nagar Run scheme, which was announced by the MoEFCC, which was basically the Vajra forest in Pune, which Dr. Apte is going to talk about, served as a role model for the scheme, and now the plan is to develop 200 urban forests across the country. So we see a lot of this mainstreaming, a lot of connect and synergy between different schemes and the overall national climate agenda. And at WWF, our engagement cities is basically about that, to mobilize and encourage the cities to build capacities, to facilitate peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, to sensitize the cities, and basically to make this access available to case studies, to experts and everybody to come together and start this entire discussion around what's really important, and how do we take forward this entire goal of low carbon and climate resilient cities. So without taking any more time, Devyank has already introduced our distinguished panelists. So I'll immediately move on to basically hear the insights from our panelists. And I'd like to first invite Dr. Uma Maheshwaran to kindly share with us more about how nature-based solutions in building climate resilience is being sort of integrated in the efforts such as the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework, the work that the Climate Center for Cities is doing, which Dr. Uma Maheshwaran heads, the National Urban Policy. So how are we looking at climate resilience, and how is, at the government level, how is basically this being integrated with the overall climate agenda? Over to you, Dr. Maheshwaran Rajshekhar.
Thank you, Dr. Suchasmita. May I request you to please give me the permission to share my screen? While you do that, a very good afternoon to all the eminent panelists who are here, and also to the participants who have taken time to attend this particular session. Thanks to WWF and the Smart City Expo for organizing this particular thematic area, which is very important given India's development and strategy. I hope everyone is able to see my screen. So I would like to take you through what we are doing at the Climate Center for Cities. The C-Cube was a recent initiative which was launched when the COVID was happening by our Honorable Minister of Housing and Urban Affairs, Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri. So the main idea for launching this particular center was not to look at climate as a separate initiative. Our Indian cities are doing so much with respect to infrastructure development and also with respect to various degree of interventions, both adaptation and mitigation. But many a times the key problem is how do they document it? How do they see the progress which they are planning to achieve? And in order to do that, and also to facilitate some of the cities which are at the early stage of thinking and planning, how do we give them a direction which is more strategic to help them not only implement but also monitor and look at the benefit. Why this particular session is important in today's time is the scale of urban investment, which both the Indian government, national government is doing, and also the state governments are doing, and city governments are anyway spending a huge amount of funds for not only operations and maintenance, but also a huge amount of funds for infrastructure development to cater to the population growth. If you look at some of the investments which India has done in the past, including the ones which for the infrastructure, there is around 30 billion of investment which has done to Smart City Mission, and there is also a certain amount of investments which are coming in terms of to enable public transportation and mobility. When this huge set of investment is coming in, why do we need to talk about climate change as a separate entity? A small intervention within all investment can actually change the face of the country and also help these infrastructure not only cater to the current needs, but also help this infrastructure function when there are critical shocks and stresses, which most of our Indian cities are facing at a regular basis. And I'm very happy to see Chennai is been doing quite a bit of work, but over the past few years, and even during the COVID, we have seen wildfires, flooding, storms, extreme events, and even civil unrest, and also heat wave taking place. Along with this, the cities are also faced with chronic stresses such as traffic congestion, aging infrastructure, and also demographic change, which is recently happening. So when we are looking at implementing climate resilience, it is not about building on one aspect of it, but how can cities look at it from a more integrated manner to take collective action. And why collective action is important, because even though the climate change is within the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change, given the scale of work which is being done by other departments, it's equally important to have a shared plan for bringing about transformation. And with that in mind, if you look at simple things like biodiversity, water, and also in terms of city services, there is not one city authority who's responsible for everything. There are so many departments which are involved in this process, and many a times everybody is trying to do things in isolation. I don't want to get into why they do it in isolation, because the structure and the mandate demands them to deliver on certain aspects. And given those constraints, now we are trying to overburden the administrators and the city managers with additional aspect of climate change. Many times when we discuss with the city and we talk about the IPCC report of 2-degree change, that 2-degree change is pretty much well acknowledged at the national level. We have signed the COP, we have also signed the Sendai Agreement, we have also part of the IPCC panel, and we are contributing to it. But the 2-degree, what that means to a particular city, what that means to a particular infrastructure, and what that means to a person who wants to champion climate actions is usually it's left unknown. And many times, even though stakeholders are interested in contributing to it, they don't know where to start. And even if they are doing something, they don't know how to showcase what they are doing to showcase impact over time. With that in mind, the C-Cube started with a simple vision of mainstreaming climate actions in cities. even though we started with 100 cities, the target is to go across 4,000 plus urban local bodies. In the previous census, it was around close to 7,000. And with the current census coming up, we are expecting that our urban local bodies are going to be much, much more than that. So how do we cater to that? In order to do that, we need certain set of things, that is to help build synergies, to bring diverse skills together, and also to help them implement development projects. It is not that you forget about the development project while we are looking at in terms of long-term planning, or even cities sometimes say that for creating a climate action plan, it takes 2 to 3 years. Should the development projects wait for those 2 to 3 years? And not only that, how do you scale that action, either within the city or across various cities? So we have a few focus area. Of course, the narrative, changing the narrative of the urban climate action, rather than being a separate element of implementing certain mitigation or adaptation activities, to mainstreaming climate within all development activities as a percentage investment, or as a lens to look at planning and also designing those infrastructure, creating a marketplace for data so that people can take informed decision. How do we bring across peer-to-peer learning, not only from cities within the country, but also cities which across the globe, and also matchmaking cities with partners. Many a times people find it very difficult to go and engage with the city, and vice versa. Cities have certain needs and they don't know who to contact with respect to technical person. And overall, to build the capacity to implement action. With that in mind, we brought about the Climate Smart City Assessment Framework, which consists of 5 thematic areas and 28 indicators. If you look at it closely, these are functions and these are mandates of many of the municipal corporations and few of the urban local bodies. But if you take any one particular indicator, what we are currently targeting is how do cities progress, rather than giving them a rank. Because many a times when we do a ranking, cities who come in the first 20, they are very active, they are very progressive. But the cities which are coming in the last 20, they usually lose hope and they don't know how to go about progressing in this. And the second problem with the ranking is cities don't know how to improve. If even a city which is getting a rank 10, if it wants to progress it to rank 5, they really don't know what to do. Do they just improve their data collection mechanism, which works well, but that is not the only solution for action-oriented planning. Therefore, we came up with a new initiative of looking at climate progress levels, what we call it as development stage indicators. We have 5 stages of development where we look at cities which are at the early stage of development. They have started thinking around it, or they are yet to start thinking around it. And then we move on to the second level where cities are not only thinking about it, but they have formed committees, they have formed coalition with the partners across various stakeholders, across various government departments to do an integrated thinking and planning. And then we have these, trendsetters and emerging leaders where cities have not only started thinking, but making an action plan. And then we have the leaders and the champion who then implement the action plan by budget allocation, by project design and project implementation. So based on these 5 levels, I'm not going to get into all the indicators, but I'm going to quickly take you through the urban planning, green cover and biodiversity, because it fits very well to the current thematic area. We have 5 indicators. One is on rejuvenation and conservation of water bodies, and we have proportion of green cover, urban biodiversity, disaster resilience, and climate change action planning. And of course, there is progressive levels across the indicators and also within each of the indicators, so that cities can pick and choose. If they really want to concentrate on their water conservation and rejuvenation, they can still do that. If they want to progress towards their biodiversity and the proportion of green cover, they can pick and choose. Not necessarily concentrate on all 5 thematic areas. And within each of the 5 thematic areas, we have a rationale. Many a times these rationales are quite straightforward and we do have a clear understanding of it. And for one of the indicator that is rejuvenation and conservation of water bodies, the 5 levels, if I take you through it, one is no action initiated. And the second level is people have at least started mapping the water bodies or documenting the water bodies which are within the city. they have started working towards creating something around the urban heat action plan. And 3 and 4 is cities manage to implement or incorporate these kinds of actions within their budget allocation and proof of fund allocation and proof of expenditure. At the same time, they have started creating planning for intervention. And stage 5 is where they have started incorporating these interventions and are able to showcase certain progress over time. The same goes for green cover. When we look at green cover in India, it is very surprising, not so very surprising with the development. I think majority of the cities don't even have 0 to 5% green cover. And that is a challenge we need to tackle. And that not only comes with tree plantation, but also ensuring that the planted tree is maintained for 3 to 5 years, post which they start giving the benefit. And so we are encouraging cities to look at various aspects of these indicators in case of biodiversity, whether there is an institutional setup, whether there is a baseline assessment, and whether there is a plan and funds available for improvement measures, and whether there is evidence of action on the ground. So this is a very challenging task, not only for the cities, but also for the ministry and also for the climate center. It cannot be done alone. Therefore, we do have a mechanism where we work with various stakeholders and partners. And these stakeholders range from research organization, academic institutions, national government, and also development banks and civil societies. And we are very happy that so far we have 50 plus partners who have onboarded, and these don't include cities. Of course, we have 120 cities which have committed to monitoring it in 2020, and they are going to keep monitoring it over the next 5 years at least. But we also have 120 cities where we have on-ground support, where cities are provided additional support rather than them being stressed with their ongoing activities. And we are looking at 96 data points which have been reported by the cities, and these will be soon launched. It will be launched next month by the minister based on our findings. So with that, I stop here, but many of you who are in the panel and who are participating on it in this particular session are already part of our alliance. If you're not, we encourage you to please join us and help us create a better and quality of life across all Indian cities. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Suchasmita.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajsekhar. That was very useful information regarding the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework and a great update since what was happening last year in all the discussions. We will come back to you with more questions on this. But moving on, may I now request Dr. Varghese to kindly share with us his experience about the success story of the Miyawaki forest in Chennai city. And so you were one of those who were instrumental in spearheading this initiative, and now it's expanding in the city of Chennai, and definitely a lot to learn for the other cities. Dr. Varghese, we'd love to hear from you more about this experience, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, one and all. First of all, I'm privileged to be a part of such an interesting and qualified panel. And most of the time, I am here to learn from all the panelists and probably from the audience also. With regard to the city of Chennai, we are one city which faces both sides of the coin when it comes to adverse weather events. We had in 2015 we had a huge urban floods, and the same very next year in 2016 we had a very severe drought. Same thing in 2019 we had a very severe drought, and in 2020 we had excess rainfall. So and it is a coastal city, and with unplanned urbanization which has happened over the last 50 years, our challenges are humongous. I mean, that is a situation with regard to the city of Chennai. But as far as my mandate is concerned, as Dr. Suchasmita was telling, I'll resort myself to explaining about the Miyawaki forest that we did in the city of Chennai. As an introduction, since this urban forestry in the dense forestation method, which is also popularly known as the Miyawaki method, is getting popular all across India. At the outset, I would like to say that it would be better in dense cities where it is absolutely difficult to find land for plantations otherwise. Many of the times we are seeing some NGOs or some organizations are planning to or trying to do it in rural areas also, where land and other resources could be in abundance. So considering the cost and effort that is involved in the plantation, maybe it would be best if we can focus that effort into our city centers. So as far as the city of Chennai is concerned, our first Miyawaki forest we planted in the year 2019 on January 25. It was, I'm sorry that I'm not carrying a presentation. Probably I'll try to send a video all across to all the panelists. I'll leave it with the host. So the land we identified was completely depleted, and it was kind of a garbage yard. And we used to clean it on and off, but still people used to come and dump a large amount of construction debris and other waste materials over there, and it was a huge heap of around half an acre of land. So we wanted to reclaim it and put it into some good use, and our staff decided that let's try putting a forest over there. And based on the advice of a consultant that we got the help from, we followed the process of Miyawaki technique, that is removing the top depleted soil layer. Around 3 to 4 feet of soil and other contaminated waste materials were removed. We removed around 1,600 metric tons of concrete waste, which was dumped all over the years, last 10 to 15 years, it got dumped over there. We removed that, and we replenished the pit with good quality soil and earth from our water body works, where our water bodies were getting developed. We got good earth from those areas, and we deposited it over there, along with good manure from our micro composting centers, and we left it for around 15 days. And after that, we did the plantation as an outreach activity. So many volunteers came from various organizations across Chennai. Around 300 volunteers came for the plantation event, and we planted around 2,000 saplings over there, which were completely native varieties. 47 varieties we planted, 47 or 48 varieties we planted. And over the course of the next 6 months or so, it became developed into a very green and lush spot. And now it is 1 year and 2 months after the plantation, and the growth is beautiful. It's phenomenal. And see, the first 3 or 4 months, we also did not have, we didn't know what to expect out of it. And by that time, COVID also came in. So in the month of January, we planted one Miyawaki forest in Chennai, and in the month of February, we planted another. So thereafter, COVID also came in, and for the next 4 months, we couldn't do much. So, but by that 4 months, by the month of July and August, we were able to see really good growth in these 2 sites that we planted, and we also got significant recognition from the civic society, and as well as from the media. And based on all the positive responses that we got, the city of Chennai decided to do at least 100 such urban forests in this year itself. And our city administration, including our commissioner, Mr. G. Prakash, took it very seriously, and across the 15 zones of Chennai, as on date, we have planted around 35 such forests, which cumulatively would be around anything more than around 1 lakh trees. and another such 25 sites are being prepared, and more or less by the next 2 months or so, we will be able to complete the plantation in this 60 forest. But this year we have identified 100 spots, and we will be able to complete the 100 forest as envisaged in this year itself. But going one step ahead, many of our based on the response from the civic society also, we're trying to improve the numbers, maybe another 100 in the next year or so. So the response from the various strata of the society has been immensely favorable and supportive. And what we started as a completely government activity, in the sense the cost and the effort and the activity with regard to our first urban forest was completely done by the civic body of Chennai. But starting from this third or the fourth forest, we started getting a lot of support from various non-governmental players, including corporates and other NGOs also. So as on date, most of the work is being done by the NGOs and other players. And what essentially the city of Chennai or the city corporation of Chennai does is to identify land and give it to the sponsoring agency which does the plantation, and to facilitate them in ensuring basic maintenance and water supply. So what started as a government or a civic body initiative, as a corporation initiative, it is more or less 80% of the work is being done by the other non-governmental players as of now, and 20% of the work is being done by the corporation of Chennai at this point of time. And we are very proud about that also, because in the long run we feel that such an initiative can only sustain if the society takes it and own it altogether. And we were fortunate to have good guidance in the beginning stages itself. All the forest, initial forest at least, we had good consultants or good people from the academia to guide us through. Thereafter, the many of the forests that is being currently done, many of the NGOs they are good at it, and they are experts of it. So I think it was a good model. Probably, I am of the firm belief that all cities are different in its framework. Whatever that is possible in Chennai may not be possible in some other city. But I think with a will from the administrative side, with a good, support from the academia and support from other non-governmental players and the corporates, and good support from the general public as well as the media, I think this can be done in various other cities of the country also. I think that's what I would like to mention about our project. Over to you, Dr. Suchishma.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verghese. That is a very inspiring success story. It's about collaboration between different stakeholders. So how intent and collaboration really can help make an impact and substantial change. We'll come back to you definitely with more questions. I'd move on now to Dr. Harini. And Dr. Harini has been working on urban sustainability issues for a long time. She's an expert. Her book, Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present and Future, really does talk about nature-based solutions and how this can be really important in sort of bringing about more resilience in the city of Bengaluru. Taking from that, Dr. Harini, we'd like to hear more from you about specifically how this is relevant to the city of Bengaluru, and especially the efforts on wetland conservation and how that has helped sort of address some of the issues being faced by Bengaluru. Over to you, Dr. Harini.
Thank you so much, Suchishmita, and the whole team for this very interesting set of, I think already the 2 presentations that I've listened to have been fascinating. So this is a very nice panel to be on. And I think this is so critical because in today's times, looking at how fast climate change is taking impact on our cities, we can no longer say it's something that we are planning for a resilient future. I think even for a resilient present, we realize that climate change is acting in the here and now, and we need to be doing something much more urgently and on much more of a massive scale than we've been doing. So I anchor the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at Azim Premji University. We have been doing a lot of work on Bangalore, but also a lot of different cities across India. And so I want to talk from that perspective and bring in, I would say, more of an insight based on a systems view and a social ecological view of the city. How society, our social systems and our ecological systems are add to the culture, the economy, and the very resilience of the city. Now, if you're thinking of resilience of the city, as we have been talking about, there are resilience, you can think of resilience at multiple scales. And one scale is the resilience of the city itself. How resilient is it to climate change, to, for instance, heat waves? How resilient is it to flooding? But there's also the issue of how resilient are the people in the city. And I think we need to keep both levels in mind. And when we say the city is not resilient to climate change, what do we mean in that? We often mean that, frankly, people like you and I and people on this panel will probably be okay, but the migrant workers, as we saw during COVID times, they will be the ones that suffer the most, or the construction workers on site, or the people who are pedestrians and cyclists who are walking, or people in slums. They are the ones who are going to get most affected, right? So with that, our work on Bangalore and on other cities in India clearly shows that, given that cities are a very unusual complex, they are engines of prosperity, and definitely in India today they are engines of prosperity. That's why you see so many people moving into cities. But you also find that they're engines of extreme inequality. And so there's this, it's like a two-faced coin, right? There's this side of it and there's that side of it. And with the limited space we have, we must make sure that any nature-based solutions that we apply are as multifunctional as they make them. So I think that would be my first point. We have been doing a lot of work, as you said, with wetland and lake restoration across Bangalore. Bangalore is an unusual city because it's a city with a long civilization. But it's a city which does not have a perennial water source. It's in a semi-arid place which is extremely dry. It's in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats. And so people got water through these, what we call lakes today, which were essentially a series of irrigation tanks created along a topographic gradient. And the Bangalore and surrounding regions once had 1,000+ of these water bodies, from very tiny ones which you would use to wash cattle and clothes, to the huge Bellandur Lake, which is now infamous around the world for its foam that catches fire, right? But these are all, they were not perennial. They used to be seasonal and rain-fed lakes, and they had open wells on both sides and wetlands, so that would be acting as sponges that absorb the water through the rainy season, prevented the floods, and like a sponge, you release that water to the city through the whole year. What you have now is a system where many of those smaller lakes have disappeared for good. Many of the lakes in the heart of the city have disappeared for good. However, the hope that we do have is in that the peripheral areas of the city, there are a lot of lakes, and thanks to a lot of citizen movements and collaboration between the BBMP, that's a municipality, and the citizen movements, you find a lot of lakes have been restored and are being actively maintained through this collaboration. Right? So what are the learnings that we can get from these? I think I just, in response to the other two very interesting talks, both from the India scale and the Madras scale, Chennai scale, I was thinking there would be 5 points that I would like to add here. First is, as I said, that cities are very scarce spaces. So anything, whether it's a lake or an urban forest or even a street lined with trees or a park, must be thought of as a multifunctional space. And when I say multifunctional space, the kinds of planting that you do or the kind of restoration that you do must address multiple environmental and ecological needs. And what are the big ones in the cities? We need to avoid flooding. We need to ensure that rainwater is protected and regenerated into the ground as opposed to running off. We need to make sure that urban heat island effects are reduced. We need to make sure that air pollution is reduced. And very importantly, we need to make sure that it provides mental stress relief in the city, because cities are extremely stressed places. And for the poor, we need to make sure that there are some components of edible trees. Right? Because there is that component that people always, you look at migrant workers or slums, people always foraged. We are doing studies even now in Bangalore. We did a study of just 200 low-income houses in the heart of the city, all the way to the edge. And there are women there who have given us close to 100 different species that they still forage for the wild. which are greens of various kinds. We might be eating the standard 3/4 greens, but these women know about 80, 90 different species, so that's their microcosm of traditional ecological knowledge, which is still thriving at the heart of the city. However, when we tend to restore our lakes and we restore our wetlands and we create urban parks and forests, first thing we do is we ban the grazers, we ban the fishers, we ban women from foraging. We ban any of these associated activities, which really then what you have is a restored place, but it becomes a recreational space. If you take Bangalore again, which is a good example of many cities across India, there is a focus by planners definitely to plant trees, but to plant ornamental species, because they say otherwise if you have fruiting trees, the traditional mango, tamarind, jackfruit, which is what our cities were known for, are no longer planted for two reasons. One is that the fruit will fall and make places messy, so cleanup is a problem. But the second is even more interesting. They say people will fight about who these fruits belong to. And that gives you a sense of how much we have taken for granted that cities have broken us down into different kinds of human beings who cannot cooperate and don't know the value of trees, right? Which is not true simply. So let's say we had a massive focus on the kinds of trees that we planted or the kinds of lawns that we planted, from apartments to corporate lawns to, we have done this, for instance. We worked with corporate groups to transform some of their campuses into fruiting trees, or away from purely ornamental plants into plants that attract butterflies when they migrate. So some campuses now have thousands and thousands of monarch butterflies in migration that light up the campus. Think of what it does to those IT employees who now can interact with nature and understand why it is important to keep cities as part of the migratory corridor for butterflies, right? So multifunctionality, I think that would be my first thing, that when we focus on any of these restorations, we must think of what is the bang for the buck? How can we make this as multifunctional as possible? And here the buck is not money, but it's just square foot of land, right? So white roofs, for instance. Why would you have white roofs? Can you instead have people that plant on these roofs? So you have edible gardens, and do that in every Anganwadi, do that in every college, so that when you have these midday meals, children can actually use that food which they have from their terrace into their food. So you get resilient children in Anganwadis. So that's what I mean by multifunctionality. Okay? The second is, we must understand that justice is a very important component, because nature in the city is really depended on by the poorest of the poor. So we must make sure that when we restore these spaces, we also make sure that, for instance, our parks are not gated. And let's take Bangalore again. Most of our neighborhood parks are closed from 10 to 4. And most of these parks were always created with a government school opposite, and that's the only play area that the government school children have. So if you close the park from 10 to 4, you are essentially saying the school teachers can't take the children to the park, and these schools are anyway in the heart of the city. They're completely built. So you are depriving these children of access to play spaces, which the children in private schools will have. So you must make sure that any of these places has its justice component, which is also an ecological component. So let's take lakes, water bodies. There is no water body in an Indian city, however prosperous the city is, which will not have sewage. And you cannot clean up the sewage purely by sewage treatment plants, because you still have nitrogen and phosphorus which come in, which are going to encourage a lot of bio growth, which is why you have these water weeds on plants. If you had the grazers coming in, then the cows would graze on that vegetation, which is what we always had, and that would naturally reduce this. If you prevented the concretization of these drains in these large infrastructure projects, we concretize the whole place. We reduce the wetland and we make it into a jogging path. So much concrete. If you had the plants, it would slow down the filtration and again do a natural cleanup. Right? So when you're thinking of the justice component, you're also thinking of the ecological component. They're not separate. There are ways to fuse these, and we are not thinking of them. We need to add that very much in. So that's my second part. How do you think of the justice component? The third component, I would say, is, and the two speakers previously spoke about this, I think, in very interesting ways. So I'd just like to build on that, about polycentricity. How do you get all the multi-level stakeholders involved in this? So for instance, let's say you do a restoration of a lake or a wetland or an urban forest. There will always be a college next to it or a school next to it. Can you involve the school or the college children in a very simple monitoring exercise? Track the heat. Track the kinds of birds that used to visit and see how there's come back. Track the butterflies that come back. Track all the people's uses that come in. We are doing this, for instance, in Bangalore. There was this tradition of village forests of Gundutops, which were village groves made of fruiting trees, mango, jackfruit, tamarind, all useful trees. around Bangalore which have largely disappeared. So based on our research, we've come up with a multilingual book, a Kannada and English book, which is a popular book, which we are now working with the Karnataka state government to see if that can go as a book into all school panchayat libraries for school children across, along with little toolkits of how a teacher can take this and along with this, use certain exercises with children. So again, I'm saying that how can you build this into certain kinds of teaching activities, which when you do this monitoring, because they were talking about monitoring, and monitoring is a very important exercise, can we make this monitoring polycentric? Can you do the same thing with corporate groups, for instance, where you say that employees, you can have a little portal and you say you create a park or you create some kind of a water body. Can we have employees coming up with some kind of monitoring activities where they can then post it? And these are ideas again that we have tried out. And you can say that the person who does the best amount of tracking or has the largest list of butterflies or whatever gets a little prize. These are motivating ways that make it not just a CSR activity, but something that transforms minds and attitudes, right? How can you get all these different stakeholders? I think the most successful lake groups that have been doing rejuvenation in Bangalore are the ones who have actually gotten stakeholders from CSR groups to the local slum next door, to the government school next door, to people coming in as volunteers and getting this entire system to work together along with the government. So that's the third. How do you get this kind of polycentricity? My fourth point would be, what does one track and measure? I think it's very important, definitely, that we should track and measure the kinds of things that Dr. Uma Maheshwaran was talking about. For instance, lake shape files, and looking at the area of parks and things like that, and putting that up for citizens to access. So extremely important. In Bangalore, we have been pushing for the longest time for an open source tree map of the city, so we can track the number of trees and see when they are being cut, and look at, and citizens can add to that data. So that's very important. We should also, though, the only thing I'd like to add there is, we have to figure out how to measure things that may not be easily measurable, which are kind of indicators of ecosystem functionality. So for instance, again, when we say urban forests, are we planting the same species everywhere? And when we're saying urban forest, and you have a set of, for instance, eucalyptus is not an urban forest, or maybe a forest should not be in a wetland, and there are those kinds of wrong ways of restoring ecosystems which are not functional, which look like they have trees or look like they have water spread spaces, but are not functional. So how do we restore ecosystem functionality? And in these measures, what are the measures that we can put to track whether ecosystem function is, whether it's a thriving ecosystem? You will not get the nature-based services you want unless it's a thriving ecosystem. So what are those measures? That is tricky. It's not easy to come up with the kind of measures that you can have, which will apply across India and across ecosystems and across types of, whether it's wetlands or whether it's forests. But we have to think of those measures and come up with how do you track them. So that's my fourth thing. How can we track that? And the last, finally, my fifth point would be, how do we maintain a systemic view? Again, I'm going back to Dr. Uma Maheshwaran because he said that, and I think that's really critical. How do we get this kind of a functional systemic view? I'll take Bangalore as an example. Just while we are talking about planting and regenerating urban forests in Bangalore, and there are plans of the government to come up with a lot of urban forests across Bangalore, which the city definitely needs. At the same time, the Bannerghatta National Park, which is one of the jewels of Bangalore, there is a metro that goes right next to it, and there are proposals to reduce the eco-sensitive zone. Or let's say we do lake restoration in Bangalore, and you do one lake, you're doing Bellandur Lake and you spend a lot of money on it, or you do Kaikondrelli Lake, but you don't do the upstream and the downstream lakes. So how do we do all of this in a systemic enough view that we are making as much of an impact to the city and not just one project by another? So these are my 5 points, and I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harini. This is a very interesting discussion. We are unfortunately limited by time, but look forward to hear more from you in future.
Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Actually, 3:45, I have a meeting, I have to rush. So if you allow me to speak, I can.
No problem. Yes, I was coming to you next, Dr. Hutsar. So please, we'd like to hear from you about the experience in Delhi, about the Biodiversity Parks program, please.
Thank you so much, madam. I am amazed to see all these esteemed panelists and their eco-restoration plan. And Actually, if you allow me to share, I would like to show you for 5 minutes, because biodiversity is a subject which is being used, overused, misused and abused every day. But the moment you see it, you get a stick to it and you love it. So therefore, while speaking about biodiversity, it's very important to see that what is that biodiversity. So I would like to share some of the slide. Yeah, I tell you, this is a subject I would like to share. But first and foremost, while talking about urban forestry, we must understand what is biodiversity. And while defining biodiversity, it is very important to understand that biodiversity is not variety alone. If biodiversity is variety alone, then probably, sustaining biodiversity would be very, very difficult. It's still not. Is it visible, madam? My presentation.
Yes, we can see your screen, Dr. Gutser. We can see your screen.
Now you see?
Yes.
So it's very interesting to see the term and topic you have used, especially the resilient term itself, makes me excited, because when you look at the forest and any ecosystem, until it is functional, receiving resilience would be very, very difficult. And therefore, I would be talking about restoring urban forestry for environmental sustainability and resilience. The latest example, if you see, of pandemic COVID-19, one of my friend Rajneesh from Madhya Pradesh Forest Department has came out very clearly suggesting that wherever per capita forest was excellent, there were no incidences of COVID-19, or they were very low. What it suggests, that plantation alone cannot make you resilient. You need to understand that what plant you are going to plant. And many a time, new research suggests that your plantation may accelerating climate, activity, may affecting your climate change more rapidly, may emitting more carbon, may consuming more water from your soil. So therefore, before designing and deciding restoration, there's a set principle about it, and those principles need to be followed. Otherwise, whatever you do in urban forestry, they are very tricky, this way or that way. Either you achieve or you lose, because with a limited resource, the cornerstone of evolution itself suggests that when you have a limited resource, you need to plan in a very meticulously way so that you do not waste your resource. So this is one of the examples that suggests that it is not only plantation, but you need quality forest to sustain your city from diseases like pandemic, like COVID-19. What it suggests, it also suggests that you need to have a complex ecosystem within urban forestry. And the moment, if you have a complex ecosystem, then probably pathogens tend to get diluted within the system. If you encroach, if you make a road, if you cut forest, if you fill your wetland, what is happening in most of the city, wetland and marshes being filled up for construction. So the moment you are simplifying your ecosystem. At the moment your ecosystem is simplified, this pathogen tend to spill over, and they will spill over and create problem, what havoc entire globe is facing. What is the urban footprint? Quickly we'll see that forest has shrunk, encroached, and invaded by very typical woody and shrubby woody species. And you have growing population of pigeon, and we are losing population of sparrows. Similarly, most of the rivers, this is Yamuna, and down there is Ganges. Both you see, most of the rivers are slowly becoming sewers. So biodiversity is very important, on which we actually live, and many other organisms lived on the basis of biodiversity. So why we are talking about biodiversity, and why we are talking about resilience, a resilient city, along with urban forestry, because this is the basis of our survival. And it is very essential to understand that ecological sustainability key for long-term survival of human beings, and biodiversity is very critical to it. What is sustainability, which you need to understand? And this definition I did not collect from book, but this definition in fact is from from our experience, which we do on the ground. the sustainability suggests that ability of an ecosystem to maintain ecological processes. And what are those ecological processes? When you see, these ecological processes are in fact succession, biogeochemical cycle, which what happen in what you call nature. You need to go very close to nature. Only then these ecological processes starts and makes your system functional over a longer period of time on the face of external stress. There are many external stress, which first speaker from NIUA was talking about, that those stresses are very serious and deleterious, in fact, for human life. Therefore, when you look at the external stress like pandemic, one of the example, flood, many other, pollution, in fact, these are all external stress. And if you need to create sustainability for resilience, you largely depend on variety and variability of a species and habitat, what you call as biodiversity, which in fact enable the ecosystem to carry out natural processes in the face of external stress. So what is resilient urban centers when you see it? It is in fact ability to anticipate, prepare, and respond to the extreme event due to changing climate. Now question arises, are we reaching closer to these, what you call, concept and goal that anticipate? Are we able to anticipate the problem going to be, incurred on our head due to climate change? Are we prepared enough? And what would be the responses to these extreme events? We need to understand. And why this resilience is important? Probably, which I understand, I don't know, which it is all for all panelists to see whether I'm going in right direction or not, that probably resilience may bring the complicated issues erupted due to climate change into locally manageable tasks. What do you mean by it? You may ask. It means that, for example, if you want to reduce the risk of flooding in city, you have to go for a restoration and conserving floodplain wetland and establishing floodplain forest and grassland, which also improves air quality index in the city. Other example, when you see that sustaining crop, even on the face of what you call longer drought due to higher temperature, what you do, you need to be ready through different cultivars improvement, or you may also think about crop change pattern, that where you change a crop from winter to summer or summer to winter so that it can withstand even though you have extreme temperature. So these are things we need to understand for establishing resilience as far as urban forest is concerned. So what would be the best practices when you see? In my opinion, the best practices would be conserving existing life-supporting landscapes. What are the life-supporting landscapes? These are the natural forests which exist. These are the wetlands. These are the floodplain along the cities. So when you start, supporting what you call existing ecological landscape either by restoring them closer to their ecological pristine glory, or you keep at least intact what you have today. So legendary ecologist Professor C.R. Babu of Delhi University, who has been Vice Chancellor and well known for his ecological, technologies, utilizing plant as a tool given by him. So he has given a model called biodiversity parks, and which is being now seen as a viable option for sustaining urban biodiversity. And many regulatory agencies like CPCB and judiciary like Honorable NGT has given many directions suggesting that use biodiversity park model to rejuvenate your rivers. So when we talk about biodiversity park, and biodiversity is very important to understand that across the country people are looking for biodiversity parks. So we came out with a definition. We have published a definition which says that a designated area with an assemblage of species in the form of biological communities belonging to the particular ecological range. This is very important to understand, madam, that particular ecological range is very important. If you talk about Yamuna floodplain, then you must consider plant species from Yamuna floodplain. You cannot think about plants from Western Ghat. Only then you can get necessary ecosystem functions, including conservation, education, and recreational values. So now Delhi has 7 biodiversity parks, Delhi Development Authority and DDA working on it. And if you see, as far as documentation is concerned, just on 19th of March, Honorable LG has released a book on 7 biodiversity parks. So biodiversity parks are not theory. I must tell you, madam, biodiversity parks are such initiative where many of the ecological functions are transformed into reality, what you call as ecosystem goods and services. This is one of the Barasti Park, Yamuna Barasti Park, which is spread over an area of 457 acres. We started with highly alkaline soil with a lot of weedy species around. Now you can see, initially when we came here, we thought of raising the land and we had requirement of huge amount of soil. If you bring soil from somewhere else, you are going to create not only ecological disaster to that site, but you are going to spend a lot of money. Therefore, we looking at the various indicator species like Typha, Phragmites, etc., which suggests that subsoil aquifer is very high. We dredged the area on the basis of contours and excavated material utilized to create mound, if you see here in left. And after 15 years, this is the transformation. This entire area has been rejuvenated, and this is narrow shallow wetland of 1.5 kilometers had been made. And you can look at the human habitation in the surrounding. You can see. And what happened to it? You may ask what you achieved. Suddenly, the moment we restored Phragmites Typha forest community, we started getting huge heronry. Birds which has lost their home in Delhi since last 25-30 years, they started coming in and breeding. And especially one of the beautiful birds, the night heron, and other birds like darter, this is also near threatened species, started breeding in. And madam, the wetland we have restored, which has started receiving plenty of migratory birds every year. Even today you come, you will see many migratory birds from Europe, Siberia, and China is still sitting in the park, but they are ready to go back, return migration. When you look at the restoration of terrestrial, habitat in our Yamuna Barasti Park, we have utilized excavated material from the wetland to create these mounds, you see. And now, after 15 years, this has been transformed like this. And this is one of the forest community established in Yamuna Barasti Park, which actually shows 3-story forest, top canopy, middle story, and ground vegetation. If you carefully see, the thick ground vegetation ensuring us that most of the carbon reaching to the park would be getting permanently fixed into the soil. And not only that, as I told you, creating biological community is very important for urban forestry to get maximum amount of ecological goods and services, and for which faunal association become very important. So the moment we have established forest community, we started getting many animals which you see in the photograph. Quickly, I will show you. Similarly, this was the part where actually it was inactive floodplain of Yamuna, and now I will show you that what we have done in active flood zone of Yamuna, which receives periodic flood, where we have restored about 100 acres of wetland. If you see, a wetland of 100 acres has been restored with the objective to keep substantial amount of flood water, because we understand that these wetlands, floodplain wetlands, are very specific and they have characteristic of acting as a nursery for river. Not only nursery, they also act as a kidney, because historically when you see, there were many villages along the rivers, and all those villages were producing some sort of sewerage. They were not going directly to the river, but they were going through these wetland and marshes to the river and getting clean. So this is the transformation. You see, the forest and wetland has been restored in 6-7 years in phase 2. And what it leads to, where we reached by doing it, we have rediscovered a snake after 70 years, madam. This is sea-boldy snake, rediscovered after 70 years. And after 30 years, one of the bird with his large-crested grebe started coming in our wetland. These are the indicators suggesting the direction of restoration. This is very important to understand that when you we carry out any restoration program, these indicators need to be monitored and documented for long-term sustenance of the system. And one fine morning, we got phantom of the forest. The animal of highest trophic level not only came, stayed 20 days, killed 2 nilgai calf, was ready to stay, suggesting that all trophic cascade has been addressed and our system is functional. But forest department got very upset, and finally it was caught and sent to Rajaji National Park. So these are the success stories. Similarly, we have Aravali Barasti Park, knowing the fact that Delhi has 2 life supporting landscape. One is river Yamuna and other is Aravali hill ranges. Aravali is spread on an area of, say, around in Delhi itself, it is 7,777 hectares area. But when you go closer to the system, you will find that most of the ridge, which is designated the ridge must be knowing, is nothing but Prosopis juliflora or Bilati kikar, a Mexican weed which came 200 years ago, killed ridge. And the ecological goods and services we expected from the ridge, we are not achieving it. So we got this area which has a lot of mined out areas with ditch of different size full of Prosopis juliflora, without changing any landscape, without interfering in the landscape. We have restored the area in thick forest, if you see. The vegetation barrier we have created, ultimately it reduces PM 2.5 in a way that if, say, about 40 kilometers away, air quality index is 500, then we get 120. This is the changes. And this is the grassland we have developed, characteristic grassland of Aravali we have already developed, and suddenly these animals have started coming in. Jackal, once, I remember in the old days near Delhi University, we kept hearing the calling and calls of jackals, which we have lost. Now we restore them. They have already arrived in our Aravali Biodiversity Park. And this is another interesting park, that is Neela Haus Biodiversity Park. Historically, it was giving drinking water to entire South Delhi, that is Mehrauli area. But over a period of time, it was filled up, silted heavily. And when this bridge was constructed during Commonwealth Game, this was dead. Citizens went to High Court, and they have been asked, court has directed DDA to do it, and DDA asked university to carry out some experimentation. And from the sewerage water, we have restored it utilizing constructed wetland systems, where physical and biological treatment is given to sewerage, which convert into water equivalent to tap water or river water. So I would like to conclude that such biodiversity parks become ecologically resilient landscape with varying habitat types, water regime, and altitudinal gradient, could contribute to adaptation through maintaining and restoring native plant community, wetlands, and grassland. You may ask, madam, that how you can say that it is ecologically resilient structure. Since last 3 years, we see that northern part of the country is facing serious problem with the migratory birds. The number are going down and down. But these biodiversity parks, especially Yamuna Biodiversity Park, is still receiving large number of migratory birds. Huge congregation, just very close to Yamuna. But Yamuna had no bird. Yamuna Biodiversity Park has more than 3,000 birds, belonging to 30 species. That itself says that it's a resilient structure. In summer, please visit Delhi everywhere. It is dry, but please come to Biodiversity Park. You will see green canopy and you will enjoy the greenness. The last word I would like to say, most of the time people raise question that how you do it. Actually, the principle of ecological restoration suggests that you need to have a site. The moment you get a site, you look at the ecological history of the site. When you, after looking at the ecological history of the site, you try to find out reference ecosystem need to be replicated. Then on the basis of available resource, you fix the timeline and carry out the program. But the money, any money which is expended on it should be seen as an investment, because biodiversity is the life. It is insurance of life itself. Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khud sir, for this very enlightening presentation. And it was wonderful to see those very interesting and beautiful pictures from the work that has been going on in Delhi. Congratulations to you, sir. We understand that you will have to leave, but please stay on as long as you can, because we'd like to come back to you for some more questions later. But in case you have to leave, thank you so much once again. Very quickly, and since we are running a little behind schedule, Dr. Vinita Apte, may I request you to kindly share with us your thoughts and your insights on the Varje Urban Forestry Project that was also the role model for the Nagar Van scheme that was later introduced by the Government of India. Over to you, Dr. Apte.
So thank you. Good afternoon to all the eminent panelists, and it was a really learning session which we are here to see. This is the real future of fighting the climate change, which I always say that forests are not built in a overnight, but really everyone needs to struggle to brought up the forest here. And in Pune, we have started this urban forestry project in 2014-15. Actually, I have set up my organization and I started searching for such kind of huge projects where we could grow the forest. And you may not know, but Pune is surrounded by the hills. And earlier, means 50-60 years before, there was a huge forest nearby and surrounded in Pune. But nowadays, because of this crawling and developing as a developed city, Pune is crowded with the buildings, and roads and whatnot, means industries all over surrounded by Pune. So we started the project under the guidance of the then Environment and Forest Minister, Mr. Prakash Javadekar. He was taken a keen interest in this project, and of course Maharashtra Forest Department and department from Pune, they have already completed the compound in this Warje hillock. It was earlier 78 hectares of land which was barren, but now in the last 10-15 years there was lot of encroachment, and only 16 hectares land was there whether we could plant the trees, and forest department was keen to start the project over there. Then we started to see how we could collaborate with the people and basically with the CSR partners. So we got some good CSR partners. They are also interested to plant the trees and develop the green cover around the Pune city. Pune has a very good green cover, we could see, but it is not sufficient for the growing population and for the growing transport. So we started this project, and basically the Maharashtra government and central government was keen interested, and that way it was little bit easier to NGOs like us to complete and implement that project. So this earlier we have started with planting of 4,000 trees on that hillock. The trees are almost 8 to 10 feet of height. So it was already grown up trees we have started to plant, and that way it was benefit for in a very near future. You could see the projection of that plants, which is really little amazing to change the barren land in the green land. Can you share the next slides? 2 slides, because I don't want to go into the text part. Everyone knows it. I already told that 16.8 hectares land was there, and their policy was the implementing partner with the forest department, and we have a couple of CSR partners like Tata Motors. Tata Motors has a major stake in this partnership. Persistent Foundation is also there, and there were a lot of people participation in this project we could get, and that is because of the people participation that project has grown up. Next. So this was the earlier. I mean, this was the situation in 2015. But this all land we got it cleared by the JCB and all with the machinery, because it was a really dumping yard for the slum area around there, and the overall that pollution was so high. When I was there and I was looking after cleaning of that land, I was sick after the day, immediately after the day when I started cleaning this land. So this was the situation in 2015 January, and we have followed it in 3 phases. So in 2015 June, the second picture is there, which you can see. What is the after effect of the plantation when we planted 4,000 trees over there in the first phase. Then these 2 pictures are also that. This picture, the 4th picture, is almost 2 years after the plantation. So that time these plants are really big and visible. Next. This people participation is, we call that as a Smriti Van, because people have adopted the plants. People can adopt the plants in the fond memory of any of the relative, or people can give the gift of that plant as they desire. So in collaboration with the Forest Department and Care Policy Center, we put the boards who have adopting that plants. But it is really difficult to outreach this project of Smriti Van because people know that how we can adopt and everything, but they just get the adoption. We are interested that they adopted that plant and they used to come over there to visit, to see how it is growing, and those are the emotions which we could give to the plant. It will grow very fast. Next. So this after 3 to 4 years, these are the outcome of this project. Means in future we could make more oxygen due to these plants, because overall 9,000, more than 9,000 big trees are planted on the Warze Hill, and there were 1,000 to 1,500 footfall every day. People are coming for a morning walk, evening walk. They used to take care of the plants in the summer season. So this is a rough idea of it absorbs about 1,29,000 kilograms of CO2 per year, and it produces 5,62,000 kilograms of O2 per year. And this whole area gives the biodiversity, an increase in biodiversity. There are 25 plant species, 29 bird species, 15 butterflies, 10 reptile, and 3 mammal species. And around 1,500 visitors every day they are coming there. In summer we used to give the water by the tankers, and people also give the voluntary contribution to put the water, grass cutting, and so many things they are doing on their own over there. Our partners and their team also coming, I think twice in a year, to see how the plants are growing, and they do volunteering also. Next. So these are the 29 bird species who always visited in that Warze Smriti one. Earlier there was only crows all over that barren land, and they was wandering over there, but now there are really good birds coming, and many researchers and many photographers come to take photographs in the morning for this kind of nice birds. Next. These are the butterflies. They start from the end of the September and around February, March, the butterflies are there. Next. Many snakes are there, but those are not very poisonous. Of course, only cobras. But they are in the, we can say, in rainy season, and during this winter, there are many snakes. They are going here and there, because it is coming a dense forest in some area, and there were no pathways, so people are not going there, and that's why this biodiversity and reptiles are staying there very happily. Next. So this is the small presentation, because there was a very less time for us and for this session, but it is wonderful session, and I think I'm very much proud to be a part of this Warze forestry, urban forest, and of course MOEFCC have declared that 200 urban forests they are under pipeline, and every city needs this kind of forest. Otherwise, people cannot live in these polluted cities. The polluted cities are the main cause of health hazards, and this kind of forest give you unpolluted air, clean air, and which will be increasing trend in Pune city, because around the Pune city, then Ter Policy Center, means we are in collaboration with Forest Department. We have planted more than 1 lakh trees nearby Pune and around Maharashtra, as well in some part of Gujarat. So we are very much happy that people are with us. Many CSR companies are coming forward to develop the urban forest. And this is the way we could fight the climate change and with these urban forests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Apte. That was a great presentation, and also very crisp. And thank you so much for being in time. We'll come back to you definitely, learn more about this initiative. And I'll finally move to Ms. De Silva, Ms. Talula De Silva. And being a member of the Panaji Biodiversity Management Committee, we'd like to know more from her about the initiatives that the city of Panji is taking in integrating urban biodiversity into their overall city level plans. I believe that the Panji Corporation was recently awarded by the state authorities for being the first municipality, the first corporation to really initiate this project in Goa. So we'd like to learn more about this from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for involving me and being a part of this very interesting discussion. So many lessons to learn, also so many spaces which are familiar. I recently visited about more than a year ago Mehrauli, and I could connect with the images that were shared by one of the presenters. My association with the local body, that is the Corporation of the City of Panjim, has been really long, over a number of years, possibly right from the year 2009. In my capacity as an architect, but I've been largely involved in doing a lot of walks in the city and sharing my experiences with the city, the green spaces in the city, and also to look at the intrinsic connection which sometimes we do not see. So when we look at climate resilience, can you see the screen? Yeah, are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes, thank you.
Go to the slideshow mode.
Yes, thank you. So basically, when we look at climate resilience and you look at nature, we find that nature has the ability to, really take in, the vagaries of climate change. And then you look at cities and you see, if nature can be in a way resilient, what is it that we are missing in cities? And for a long time, along with the corporation of the city and various other departments, we've been working with children. I've been working on numerous initiatives with children, simply to create that understanding, to create awareness about, the role of these natural systems. And I personally believe, that many of our systems that already exist, our infrastructure that is already climate resilient infrastructure that exists in the city, and we should do our bit, to simply conserve it. So if you look at the map of Panjim, as you see on the screen, we are a coastal city. We have the sea on the west, and we have a lot of rivers. Okay, Panjim, of course, has the main river called Mandovi River, and on the other side we have Zuari River, and they meet at a point at a place called Donapola, which is the end of the city. Besides this, of course, therefore, there are coastal ecosystems, there are riverine ecosystems, there are estuarine ecosystems, and one of the most important ecosystems in the city are something called the Kazan ecosystems. And these are really, really old. They were built, more than 3,500 years ago by the traditional community, the indigenous people, that simply saw the value in building the floodplains to make this complex network from which they could, get their livelihoods from. So we are basically I'm going to share my experiences of the systems that exist in the city, which we have documented as part of, the extensive documentation that we have done, which we have submitted to the Goa State Biodiversity Board. Okay, so this is the beach ecosystem that exists. The Miramar beach to be in particular, a lot of vegetation, and a lot of the vegetation is also fairly new. So in partnership with, let's say, the forest department, or let's say the state biodiversity board, a lot of little patches of urban forestry that have been taken up and are going to be taken up. So we have Ipomia, we have casuarina trees, and one of the best practices, that the city did was many years ago, they invited, a lot of experts. One of them was Antonio Mascarenhas. And this particular beach was well known for sand dunes, which had over time, flattened because of a lot of activity of people coming to the beach. and these were restored in the most efficient manner, in the most economical manner, most natural manner, where little screens of bamboo and twigs were placed at certain distances along the large flat beach, and many of these were restored. So we often take children. Most of the pictures that we will see will be work that we are doing with students, college students, school students, and students from underprivileged community from certain areas, where we hope that they'll take ownership and help restore many of the systems that we talk about today. Yeah. The next one is we've been doing a lot of tree walks in the city with various experts. So rich, with a lot of trees, tree avenues that were of course planted pre liberation, post liberation, when many of these areas were reclaimed and built over. So one of his assets are the large cover of trees, and today you'll find the distinct difference when temperatures are rising. It's very, very hot, and in these areas you'll find that there's a visible drop in temperature. It's much more cooler. Panjim is known for its large, stretch of mangrove forests, and we are lucky that it's one of the only cities, possibly one of the few cities, that has a mangrove cover along its edges, because of course the rivers and the backwaters which are part of the Khazans. So there was a project taken up by the state government, where a part of the mangrove stretch along the Ore Creek was done up with walkways, which has given the opportunity for a lot of people to come and spend time and understand about the mangroves. And besides this, of course, regular walks are done to look at biodiversity of the mangroves, which is so unique, and to understand its main role of climate resilience. We all know that all the mangroves provide a buffer against tidal currents, against strong winds, against even calamities. And the more we work with students, the more we work with children, they are able to make this connection. I think that is very, very important and part of the work that we've been doing. One of the pictures is the work that we've also done with visually impaired children, blind children, where the facility or the interpretation center has certain tactile surfaces where the children can also understand what we are talking about when we talk about mangroves and climate resilience that mangroves or the mangrove buffer provides. Okay, this is what the Khazan is all about. So all along the river there are these little embankments. The embankments stretch back to about nearly 4 kilometers, sometimes more. All these waters are shallow because these are basically floodplains which are built on, and they're amazing because you can walk across, and a lot of the channels again are controlled by something called sluice gates. In the local language we call them manos, and it is nothing but under pressure when the tides rise, there are wooden shutters which get pushed open, and the tidal waters come in, bringing in fish spawn, and of course the saline water. So a little beyond this interface of the river to the backwaters, you have local fishers who come and fish. So a lot of the fish is collected here during the fishing ban when people cannot go out to sea. We also harvest salt in these areas. Today, of course, the issue is that during pre-liberation there were more than 300 salt pans all across Goa. Today there are barely about 30-40. In Panjim we are lucky that the Khazans that exist have salt pans, and you can see the mechanism of harvesting salt, especially during these months. And at the end of all these shallow troughs, the salt pans, we also have agrarian lands, and these are important because Goa and Kerala are the only two places which grow rice, a specific species of rice called korungut or korgut, which can grow in saline waters. So what does this tell us? It tells us that more than 3,500 years ago, our indigenous community built these systems not only for climate resilience but also to look at food security. and these need to be conserved. Today they are under threat because many of these agrarian lands, the bunds, the dikes are not maintained. They're in private ownership, and many of the fields have got inundated with saline water. There's also pressure of development because many of these fields are getting filled up for construction. We have two creeks in Panjim. They're estuarine creeks affected by tidal currents. Santines Creek and Orang Creek. Santines Creek is one of the creeks which is in dire need for restoration. We have documented everything. There are otters in the creek, otters in the city. Can you imagine? Otters in the city. We have crocodiles in the city, and a lot of avian biodiversity. So a lot of birds. In the corner picture, you can also see in the heavy pollution, there is a white-breasted water hen with a little fledgling. Okay, it means that somehow nature thrives, biodiversity will thrive while they are doing everything right. We as humans, we as city administrators, we as the community need to take action to preserve these very vital systems. We often take children along the creek to show them, the impact of pollution on the creek, and they're able to understand, and use these as project documentations, which helps them, further in various, ideation of projects that at the school level, at the college level, they're able to take to look at bioremediation solutions as effective solutions for pollution. This is the state of the Santines Creek today. It is heavily polluted. It has the potential, of course, to be restored and to be listed, as a biodiversity heritage site, which can probably afford more protection. A large stretch of the peri-urban areas of the city in Panjim, we have, wetlands and a large stretch of fields where we grow rice and paddy. Today, what is the situation? There is a lot of pressure for development. So fallow lands are taken up by private, builders and developers. And there are large tracts which are filled up and you have construction activity. Now, how is this impacting? There are traditional, fields where there are channels for drainage have got impacted. So there is more water that has been retained and they are unable to grow. There's also large amount of pollution. We all know that when there are gated communities, large communities that come up at the periphery of wetlands, the amount of sewage that is generated is very, very high. And in the absence of, systems that can help treat the septic water, there is leaching of or seeping of this, toxic water into the fields. Farmers are having problems, and so we constantly do biodiversity walks around the fields to look at agrarian biodiversity and to look at, what is the connection to food that is grown in the areas. Many of these areas are fields which have had a tradition of growing specific crops, which are unique to these areas like brinjals, ladyfingers and amaranth. Today, many stretches of the city are constantly getting flooded. They're getting flooded because of various reasons. One is, of course, of filling up of these shallow wetlands, blockage of these, many of the, traditional drains. And of course, also because, many of these are not being protected so far by the city administration. We are working on it. And we hope that, these natural systems are recognized and help to, mitigate many of the problems that is currently facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talula. It was great to see these beautiful pictures from Panjim and the surroundings. We are slightly over the time schedule that was allotted, but we have a few minutes for questions. So what I'll do is that I'll take a few questions from the audience, from what the audience has already suggested for us, and a few of my own questions, and just a quick round with all of you, and just take your final thoughts on the topic. And I'll start with Dr. Rajsekhar. So basically, Dr. Rajsekhar talked to us about the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework and how nature-based solutions is it's been recognized that that's an important way of manner of sort of climate resilience. What I would like to know from you, Dr. Rajsekhar, is that from all the information that the cities are reporting, are there any examples where you feel that cities are actually realizing the importance of integrating, or is it still being seen as that one separate piece of work, like urban biodiversity and green cover, but that understanding of the connect with climate resilience or how it is going to impact the city in the long run is still missing? What would you suggest? And if there are any cities, if you could quote a few best practices or examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smita, for that question. To be quite honest here, the first step is 126 cities are reporting in the country on all these indicators, which is a huge leap from where cities were, struggling to understand the overarching benefit of integrated approach towards urban development. So I think that's a very good step. And many of the cities, I don't want to name them, but they are not doing well across all the indicators, but they are doing well across, few of the indicators, selected indicators. But if you look at all the 28, I have at least 10 to 20 cities doing well across each of the indicators. They are not the same. They don't come from the same geoclimatic conditions. They don't come from the same tier, because tier 1 cities are progressive in certain areas. Tier 2 and tier 3 are more progressive in certain other areas. Given that biodiversity is a very important aspect, I think, of course, the initiatives indicated by, the panelists are very, very valid for municipal corporations, which are huge. But at the same time, there is a huge opportunity for tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where we are seeing more population growth. And the migration per se is not high, but much of the rural areas or the peri-urban areas are going to be coming into the development planning stages. And that is where these indicators are going to play a key role. And so I'm quite positive. The results, like I said, will be launched by our Honorable Minister next month. So you can all see where each of the cities stands and each of the regions stands. But I'm very positive that initiatives are being taken place, conducted across much of the cities. I wouldn't say all the cities, but yes, but not across all the indicators, but across selective indicators. Now that is going to give insight to not only municipal commissioners, but also INGOs, NGOs, and educational institutions, which city to intervene based on their expertise and experience. Because earlier they always used to wonder where to intervene, which city to work with. Now this framework and the results from the framework are going to give strategic directions to both cities and also strategy partners who wants to do implement. And that is also going to create a push both top down and also push bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Varghese, we have a question for you from the audience. A member of the audience is asking, how efficient would Miyawaki forest be in regions with low groundwater tables? In addition to that, I would like to also ask you that has the city of Chennai already started sort of monitoring the outcomes? What are the benefits that are already available from the Miyawaki forest, or is there a plan to sort of come up with a more comprehensive analysis of how this forest has really supported the city in terms of resilience and addressing issues like pollution, etc.? Over to you.
Yeah. So, with regard to your first question, I think I'm not a subject expert. I'm just a practitioner. So, what I understand is that it is perfectly possible to raise urban forest even in areas where groundwater may not be, available in large quantities. But it needs good care for at least for the first 2 years of plantation. In Chennai, some areas the groundwater is still available, but it is not very good, for the requirements of the plantation. Those areas currently what we are doing is that we are mobilizing water in water tankers, not water, it is secondary treated effluent water from STPs and sewage treatment and effluent treatment plants. We are bringing and using them for watering. So it could be possible, but I think it would be better to make an analysis before, whether we'll be able to maintain the forest for at least 2 to 3 years with the resources we have in our hand before going for the plantation. After 3 years or after 2 years, I think it will be completely okay. The system, the ecosystem will take care of on its own, including de-weeding or maintenance or watering. Nothing will be needed after 2 years. Our first forest will complete 2 years in the next Jan. So by that time, we are planning to phase out all the maintenance activities that we are conducting over there. Currently, our forest, one of the panelists was telling that, all this assets that we are developing should be accessible to the public also, and it should be, multi-dimensional also. So currently we are not permitting people to, come into the forest and use them for recreational or other purposes as of now. Our idea is that with 2 years we will get good amount of growth for our trees. Thereafter, we are planning to open up completely for public. We are having a footpath in all the forest. In larger forest, intertwined 2 or 3 paths are there. In smaller one, at least one concentric path on the outside that is there, and some playing material. Some space is also kept for keeping some playing materials or something. So it would be envisaged it to be a recreational as well as a public space in the years to come. So with regard to your second question, that whether we have analyzed what are the tangible and the various intangible benefits that has come from our plantations, not really. We are documenting it now. So probably after a year or so, we will be able to come with some concrete details of that.
Thank you, Dr. Verghese. So just very quick thoughts from all three of you, please, because your organizations that are working with the city authorities, supporting city authorities or governments. So I'd just like to know that what has been your experience? What do you think can be an enhanced role for the civil society research institutions and basically organizations that are supporting? Very quick thoughts, just maybe a minute each, and then we can wind up. Can I ask Dr. Apte for her thoughts first?
Civil societies are working well, and we say that we are not a government organization, but we need to work hand in hand with the government. So the government support is very much welcome, and it is a must for any civil society partners who are working. So that is my thought.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah, you want me to share mine?
Sure, Tarala, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, I've always believed, that we need to work collaboratively with everybody together. And for us at Pageant, it has been great because the current commissioner, Sanjeet Rodriguez, has been always very supportive. The state biodiversity board, Pradeep Sarmokadam also has been very, very supportive. And we've had members of TERI and so many other organizations, individuals, So I think collaboratively we achieve much more, and the experience has been fantastic. We only hope to take it further so that we can, do more for the city.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Harini, your thoughts, please.
Absolutely. I think, each place has different strengths. So government has its own very important role to play, obviously, in the city. Local communities are there on the spot. Researchers can provide that academic expertise. So unless we all work together.
Thank you so much for all your thoughts and insights. It's been an enlightening and enriching session for me personally, and I'm sure the audience would have gained a lot of insights. Thank you for sparing time, and sorry for being rushed towards the end. Thank you so much. We'll keep in touch. Bye-bye. Thank you, Divya.